Erikson's 8 Psychosocial Stages and a Psychological Explanation by Nicolette, Jeantilus. In this video, I will be referencing 4 different psychological perspectives: evolutionary, cognitive, neuroscientific, and behavioral. Here are the definitions for those perspectives. Evolutionary, a psychological perspective that views human traits and behaviors as results of evolution. In other words, traits and behaviors that are beneficial are passed down, whilst maladaptive traits are not. Cognitive, a psychological perspective that interprets human behavior with a special focus on learning, memory, and other activities generally associated with the prefrontal cortex. Neuroscience, a psychological perspective that interprets human behavior by way of biological processes, specifically those processes dealing with the brain. This field also involves the study of the central nervous system, neurotransmitters, and other parts of the nervous system. Behavioral, a psychological perspective that bases its analysis of the human psyche on stimulus-response cycles and conditioning. 1. Infancy, trust versus mistrust. In this photo, a baby is carrying out the task of Erikson's first stage of psychosocial development, trust versus mistrust. This stage is integral for healthy childhood development and develops a relationship between the child and his, her, or their caregiver. As can be seen in the photo, this little one has built trust in this caregiver, which will help her to have stable relationships in the future. Psychological perspective, evolutionary. Possible questions. Why do babies smile? How do relationships between child and caregiver influence survival? Interpretation 1. Smiles are generally a universal sign of happiness and joy. An evolutionary psychologist might interpret that babies like this one smile to communicate their content to their caregivers and ensure emotional and nonverbal communication in the future and for survival. Interpretation 2. An evolutionary psychologist might see the trust versus mistrust stage as important for survival. If the baby learns that those around her, him, or them are trustworthy and will attend to their needs, she, he, or they can continue to trust and build relationships within their group and work as a unified team for survival. On the contrary, if the baby learns that those around her, him, or them are not trustworthy, he, she, or they will be less trusting of their surroundings, more cautious, and more likely to survive. For this child, an evolutionary psychologist might see the bond forming between the child and the caregiver as an integral step in survival. 2. Toddlerhood, autonomy versus shame and doubt. In this stage of development, toddlers, such as this one here, must learn to make their own decisions and complete tasks for themselves. Otherwise, the toddler may build up shame and doubt. This toddler is already practicing autonomy with camera in hand and sitting on a ball. Psychology perspective, neuroscience. Possible questions. How does autonomy affect brain development? Is the massive amount of neural growth during these years activated by autonomy? Interpretation 1. A neuroscientist might perceive this toddler's autonomy as having major effects on brain development. Autonomy encourages exploration, learning, and therefore neuronal activity. Using a complex device such as the camera could stimulate brain activity and the development of the prefrontal cortex. Interpretation 2. A neuroscientist might also speculate that the building of autonomy may help to activate brain growth, or that the brain growth may actually be a stimulant for autonomy. This toddler's swift growth and need for cortical stimulation may actually be activating his need for autonomy. 3. Preschooler, initiative versus guilt. As preschoolers, children begin to build a sense of initiative through self-control. The children in this photo are having a snack, and each child is reacting in their own way to the camera person. These reactions, whether it be dismissal, curiosity, or posing, are one way of showing initiative. Psychology perspective, cognitive. Possible questions. How does the concept of self-control influence learning and memory? How do each of these children's reactions tie into their decision-making skills and skills? Interpretation 1. Self-control is part of self-image and self-concept, so self-control shown in this image, in this stage, must connect to other activities in the prefrontal cortex as well. A cognitive psychologist might believe that the idea of self-control is important in the process of learning and in intelligence, as it instills a sense of confidence. In the case of these three, a cognitive psychologist may interpret that the building of initiative and self-control shown will aid in their cognitive development and learning. Interpretation 2. Each of the children in this classroom are learning, and many are taking initiative. As mentioned earlier, the dismissive, curious, and confident reactions of these preschoolers are all examples of initiative, and a cognitive psychologist may interpret their reactions as outwardly expressions of their thinking and analysis of their environment. 4. Elementary student. Industry versus inferiority. In elementary school, or from the 1st to 5th grade, children are taking in all kinds of new information and are preparing for adolescence. In this stage, it is important for children to gain confidence through competence and application. The girls in this photograph are building just that by taking notes and drawing. Psychology perspective, behavioral. Possible questions. How are the girls' work affected by rewards, such as good grades, and punishments, such as bad grades? If either of these students is overwhelmed by bad grades, how will that affect their behavior in the future? What if either is overwhelmed by good grades? Interpretation 1. A behaviorist might observe the students at the right and perceive that the students seem responsible and focused. A classic behaviorist might assume that they have been conditioned by good grades, stickers, or otherwise to act in a responsible way. Interpretation 2. A behaviorist might also interpret that, if the act of drawing is rewarded by authority figures in the classroom, children such as these two may continue to pursue being creative. 5. Adolescent. Identity versus role confusion. During adolescence and the onset of puberty, teenagers and early 20-year-olds undergo a transformative period from child to adult and must find their place in society. Teenagers like this child in the photo might reflect on what they believe in, where they want to go, and who they want to be. This identity formation is extremely important for self-confidence in the next stage, intimacy versus isolation. Psychology perspective, cognitive. Possible questions. What is the process of thought in this child's mind? How is this child's introspection affecting his learning and intelligence? Interpretation 1. A cognitive psychologist would want to analyze this child's mental processes and the effect adolescence has had on him. Based on the behavior in this photo, a psychologist might assume that this teen is analyzing his surroundings and may be thinking about his future. Interpretation 2. On the contrary, another cognitive psychologist may place more emphasis on the child's perception of his surroundings and his intelligence. Through the positioning of his head, arms, and legs, his body language shows openness, skepticism, observation, and thought. A cognitive psychologist may consider this language to be caused by the onset of adolescence as well. 6. Young adulthood. Intimacy versus isolation. According to Erikson's 6th psychosocial stage, the main goal of a young adult is to find psychological intimacy and strengthen close, long-lasting relationships. If a young adult was unsuccessful in previous stages, or is not successful in this stage, she, he, or they may find isolation instead of love, as is the case with the young person at the right. Psychology perspective, behavioral. Possible questions. How might rejections and relationship issues have affected this person's state? Will a pattern of isolation begin or continue until a positive stimuli is introduced? Interpretation 1. A behavioral psychologist would notice various elements of this person's behavior. For example, the person is donning several beaded bracelets, holding up a drawing of a sad face, and wearing a hoodie. This kind of psychologist might assume that this person has been conditioned to believe that art, clothing, and creations are a way of expressing emotion. Interpretation 2. A behaviorist might also speculate why this person is isolated and sad. A few theories might include bombardment of negative feedback, consistent failure, or rewards for remaining isolated. 7. Middle adulthood, generativity versus stagnation. In middle adulthood, the primary goals are raising families and leaving a legacy. The importance of this stage is to leave a feeling of having changed or helped the world. If this is not met or trouble arise from the previous stages, adults at this stage may be regretful or stagnate by the next stage. These middle adults are raising a child and aiding the child in future survival, or generativity. Psychology perspective, evolutionary. Possible questions. How does the maternal and paternal instincts of this couple help ensure the survival of human beings? How much of parenting is determined by evolution? Interpretation 1. An evolutionary psychologist may view these parents' teachings to their child as a mechanism of survival. Passing knowledge from one generation to the next is vital to a species' survival, and riding a bicycle is a survival skill. Interpretation 2. An evolutionary psychologist might also assume that of these parents' parenting styles, or some part of their parenting styles, such as showing love and care, are affected by evolution and its benefit to survival. 8. Late adulthood, ego integrity versus despair. Ego integrity versus despair is the final stage of Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages and represents the completion of life. During this time, elders reflect on their life, reconcile their regrets, and if successful, feel a sense of ego integrity and full identity. If elders feel that their time was too short or issues from the previous stages are unresolved, they may not complete this stage successfully. The woman in this photo is reflecting on a marriage. Psychology perspective, neuroscience. Possible questions. How is this woman's brain affected by aging? What kind of effect does reflecting on the past have on the brain? Interpretation 1. Under the neuroscientific perspective, a psychologist might interpret this older woman's observation of an old photo as an attempt to access memories and stimulate the hippocampus. Interpretation 2. A neuroscientist might also view her actions as a way of strengthening her neurons by thinking and reflecting on past decisions. References. All photos in this presentation are from PEXELS.